Welcome to another episode of This Is Why I Don't Vote, a podcast. Your safe space to discuss sports, politics, social issues, and even religion, where we will take it all very seriously, but not too seriously. A little different idea for Season 3, Episode 30, a movie review with my buddy Jason, but it's not just one movie, it's two movies. We're going to compare two different movies depicting the First World War, Stanley Kubrick's Paths of Glory, and All Quiet on the Western Front, a movie that came out in the year of our Lord 2022. If you have not seen these films and you want to see these films before you listen to this podcast, please do. There is many a spoiler alert. In fact, the whole thing's pretty much a spoiler alert as we dive right in, not really a typical movie review that we try to give you some of the background and then there's a spoiler alert after that background. No, we just dive right in. You have been properly advised. Thank you all for your continued support. Please like, subscribe, thumbs up, write a review, 5 stars, whatever the approval of choice may be. Please send the podcast to friends, enemies, far and wide. This Is Why I Don't Vote podcast is on Patreon. If you like what you hear, please consider supporting.
Act 1, a movie review, or better yet, 2 movies reviewed. Paths of Glory and All Quiet on the Western Front.
Since I enjoyed it so much, and it actually was pretty well received, the movie review, I don't want to call it Two Idiots review movies. I'm trying to be less harsh with my language, particularly when speaking about myself. But I've got my buddy JB back on the podcast, and we're going to do a movie review, and a movie review that is more encompassing than your traditional, let's just review a movie. We're going to actually compare and contrast two different war movies, one from the 50s, one a recent film, the film from Germany, All Quiet on the Western Front, versus, well, I don't want to say versus, it's not really a versus, in contrast to, that's a better way to say it, Paths of Glory by one Stanley Kubrick from, I believe, the year of our Lord 1957. Jason, is that correct?
That is correct, sir.
So I wanted to do this because I really wanted you to see All Quiet on the Western Front, and you and I are both huge Kubrick fans, and that was one of the Kubrick movies from his early filmmaking career that we had not seen. Either one of us, or neither one of us, had seen it. You have reviewed both films, as have I, and then what I'd like to do, since we didn't have a lot of time to prep for this before we just jumped right in, why don't we start with Kubrick? Why don't we start with his early work, a war movie from World War I in the 1950s, and then we can move on from there, basically how not only filmmaking has evolved, but how the war film, how the action of war is portrayed in modern filmmaking. Let's look at Kubrick in his, I don't want to say his infancy. I think that might have been his second or third movie, Paths of Glory. Am I right about that?
It's his second movie. His first movie was called Killing Something, Killing Time, Killing Something. And it was not well received either financially or critically, except for in a few spaces. I haven't seen it. This is just kind of some of the reading that I've done. And honestly, Paths wasn't particularly well received in terms of box office, but it had some critical acclaim. So we'll start there.
Well, I'd like to start with what you thought overall about the movie. The movie takes place in France, World War I believe it's 1917, and it's about a failed attack against a German position. Jason, your thoughts on the film?
So my initial impressions were, first of all, this is a true blue, like, do you remember when they used to have Turner Classic Movies, and they were usually black and white, and they were usually 1959 or earlier? This is that. When it opens, you have a kind of an army band drum and fife score that even includes La Marseillaise as part of the score. And then you go narrator setup, a little bit of exposition, and then you go right into the story. This thing is so lean, Patrick. It's so tight. It's an hour and 28 runtime. It's perfect in terms of that setup. So I loved that. The other things I get from this are the kind of the 50s star thing. So when we think about adaptation, Kubrick adapted this from the 1935 novel by, I'm losing his name, Humphrey Cup. And he stayed pretty true by and large with the plot. But what he did is he shifted it from the primary focus being the three soldiers who eventually end up getting executed, and shifting it to Colonel Dax, because it's a star turn by Kirk Douglas. And I think that worked beautifully as well. I had never seen the film before, and we get into the back half and start talking about some of the technical stuff. I was really impressed with Kubrick on this, given the limitations, but they probably didn't consider them limitations at the time of what he had to work with.
I could not agree more. I was just about to say I 100% agree with you, but then I realized that we've talked and I say it 100% altogether too frequently on this podcast. What Kubrick did with what he had available to him at the time. I mean, we're talking about a movie that takes place during World War I in the 1950s, where I don't know that you had a lot of movies up to that point that did even a moderately capable job at depicting what trench warfare was like in World War I. What Kubrick did in order to create that atmosphere with the limitations that he had being a filmmaker in the 1950s, the late 1950s, I thought that was amazing. I thought some of the action scenes were extremely well done for, again, the time and the cinematography that he had available to him. And he did a really clever job at creating this very tense, very dark, I would call it world or environment. Yet he did it in a way where if you've got any kind of keen eye, it's not so much what he's doing, but what he's not doing. The way he frames the scenes, the way he frames his cinematography, the things that you can hear but you don't see, and it kind of allows your imagination to take as much hold as what you would normally do in a 21st century, Marvel superhero type movie where there's no imagination. It's all put up on the screen, right? So it's all depicted for you. In this movie, Kubrick doesn't have but so much to work with, and therefore he cleverly creates an atmosphere where you fill in all the blanks. Would you agree with that?
I think that's exactly right. And I think the way he does that, in part, is with technicality. And you and I have talked about one of my favorite shots in Kubrick movies is the really long tracking shot where they're behind Danny in The Shining, and he's on his big wheel, and it goes for like 7 minutes. And I'm like, where the hell is this kid going? He does this in 1957 with this movie. And there are kind of two and a half examples I want to give. The first one is early on. So it's after General Moreau and his last name begins with a B. I can't remember his last name. They have their meeting, and the big general convinces General Moreau that he needs to take on this attack that is sure to fail. Anyway, after that, Moreau and his major, St. Alban, are walking the trench, and they're chatting with various soldiers. And it's done with one of those tracking shots where there's a camera in front of Moreau and Alban, and it's just kind of backpedaling as he goes through the trenches, which is cool, A, because of the technology, and B, because you get to see these two characters interacting with the various soldiers, and you kind of think Moreau might be a good guy for a while. Spoiler alert, probably not.
Right.
And then you get to the huge battle scene, where you have a tracking and reverse tracking, again in the trenches to start. And what's cool about it is, and again, Kubrick's genius, they do the tracking scene where the camera is in front of Kirk Douglas. And you can see him, you see his face walking through the trenches past all the soldiers. And he's kind of chiseled and confident looking, and he's a super movie star. But when you see it from the backside, what you see is the soldiers that are looking at him, and they're scared shitless.
Yes.
So that's the first 2.5 minutes of that scene, and then he starts blowing that damn whistle, and they go into the charge, and the tracking just changes to you're looking at Kirk Douglas from the side, and he's screaming charge and blowing the whistle, and he gets about 45 yards in, and they're getting their asses kicked, and then the scene starts to end at that point. But that's an example of Kubrick doing a lot with the little, and at some point we can talk about the size of the field that he had to operate with. But that's where I'm going with, I guess, his technicality.
That's where I was going as well, because when you look at the scope of that field, and again, we're going to compare this to another World War I movie that was made within the last, I guess, 2 or 3 years. I mean, it was released, I believe, last year or at the beginning of this year. It was amazing to see what he did with so little and how he made that, we'll call it a field, the field that they had to cross, these French soldiers, in order to attack this German position across no man's land. He made it feel very expansive and very broad when I was sitting there watching it, questioning myself because it was so small. I kept thinking to myself, this is really, I was outside of the movie in the sense that I wasn't so much thinking about the violence and how scared those soldiers must have been crossing no man's land to engage in such an attack, and impressed with how well it was put together given the year and given the tools that Kubrick was given. I was like, damn, this looks really good for a movie that was shot in 1957 or probably 1956, released in 1957. So the technicality, as you're calling it, was superb in this movie. And you can see, I've never seen Kubrick's first movie. I don't know whether or not it gave him the palette or the landscape to do something like this. But as a filmmaker, you see the genius of Kubrick in his second work, right? This is not his, I had 4 or 5 movies to get this thing down, and now this is what I'm capable of. I mean, this is his sophomore album. This is his sophomore film. And it's brilliant in the way that it's shot. Whether or not any viewer or any critic as much enjoyed the story or the movie, you've got to give props to the man, the way that it was put together and the way that it's presented.
I think that's dead on. And again, we talk about what he was faced with. I don't want to overdo the technicality, and you probably saw this, but the no man's land, the field on which they created not only the battlefield but the trenches that lead up to what is clearly a model anthill, was so what I saw was 5,000 square yards, which is essentially a little less than an acre, which is essentially a football field. And he put all of that intensity and scope and all those explosives into that small of a space to get those shots. And I just think it's brilliant.
I agree. That's why so many people, if you are talking about Kubrick and you're looking at his entire filmography, so many people will go back and point to that movie. It is a sign of a genius that is blossoming. I don't know that any other director could have pulled off the same way that type of atmosphere in, again, 1957. And I'm glad that you made this reference. It was one of the things that I wanted to go on about. I was just about to say go off on, but I'm really not going to go off on it. there are a number of movies from the 50s that I really enjoy. And I can remember sitting there with my ex-wife, and we were watching several classic, is what we'll call them, classic movies. And even though we could appreciate the movie for what it still was so dated. I mean, it looked like something that came from the 40s or the 50s. And it was a limitation on the art form of that generation. There weren't that many technical things that you could do in movies. And as you said, yes, many of the scripts are tight. And the way they move into them is rapid, right? You're not going to get a 1 hour and 28 minute movie in the year 2023 or the year 2024 and have it be a blockbuster or have it even be a marquee film. They just made much tighter films back in the day. The scripts weren't always as powerful in order to carry a 1 hour and 20, 1 hour and 30, even 1 hour and 40 minute film. So many of them are dated in their dialogue and the way that they advance the plot of the film. As a screenwriter, as someone who is adapting this story for a film, Kubrick should also get kudos, right? Because that's not an easy story to tell. And I like the way, whether or not it was a collaboration, whether or not it was the studio saying this is how it's got to get done if we're going to make the film, turning the axis instead of it being on the three soldiers who were the victims of this, we'll just call it a circumstance without going into too much more detail, and putting it on the officer that led them in that attack and then is the one who ends up defending them on trial for their lives.
Yes. What I think is, yes, Kubrick should be applauded for the adaptation. And I think we'll talk about adaptation when we talk about All Quiet as well, because there's some interesting stuff going on there. But yes, what he did was make a narrative movie that has what we would consider really great action for 1957, but also had some of the late 40s, early 50s hallmarks of not necessarily noir, but kind of a courtroom thriller circumstance. And let's face it, Kirk Douglas is lights out in this. So, yeah, I think you're right about that.
Yeah, and it leads me, because we could talk about this, well, I know I could talk about it for the next 45 minutes. It leads me, though, to the one scene of the movie that I thought was the most powerful. And it's at the end where I had so many emotions in the last scene of the film. When it starts, one of the things that I noticed was that in modern movies, they do such a great job with the makeup and with the tonality. You can tell that the actors have been through something just to be a part of the movie. In other words, these aren't guys who are just going off to makeup and wardrobe and then coming in and being part of these war movies. You can see whether or not that's Steven Spielberg and Saving Private Ryan or other war movies. The authenticity is often accompanied by these guys having to go through a mini boot camp so that they look like they've slept 10 hours in the last week. They look like they've been through the ringer when it comes to the environment. They look like they are craven and that they've got that 1,000-yard stare because of the violence they've been exposed to. And that did not present itself at the end of the movie in the scene where they're in the tavern. At first, I thought it comedic because I did not buy the way these soldiers were placed in that scene. It looked like they just threw some uniforms on a bunch of extras and threw them into the scene. And yet, as the scene turns, it gets very dark. And you're almost, I don't want to say frightened is the right word, but you've got a sense of dread as they march the German woman out to sing to them. And then how it turns, the humanity of the room and of all of these people as she begins to sing and her spirits change. It was so smart and well conceived and well shot, well executed by everyone. That, to me, was the scene of the movie. And I had no anticipation of something like that being in a movie like this leading up to that last 5 or 10 minutes. Your thoughts?
So, I mean, the scene of the movie for me is the failed attack on Anthill. So, first of all, I'm glad that you brought this up. I'm going to read a quote because you started off your piece of that talking about how the various actors should have looked, the characters should have looked being put through what they had been put through in this trench warfare circumstance for a while. And this is a quote from the guy who played Major St. Alban, his name is Richard Anderson. I want to tell you why that's important. He was quoted about the movie. He said, "The trench was gruesome. It just reeked, and the weather was so lousy. It was cold. It was freezing, and we were all sick. We all had colds, and we all looked awful, but it certainly added to the film." But juxtaposed to what we see in that tavern at the end, it's, like you said, it's completely different. Those guys look fresh.
Yes.
They look like they're ready. And the sergeant comes out at some point and says, "Hey, we've been ordered to go back to the front." And Colonel Dax says, "Hey, give them a few more minutes." But they look fresh. And so that's definitely, you picked up on that, and it's a different circumstance for sure. But then it does become moving when the singer comes in, who is crying, and you don't know if she's been violated. We don't think so. But she's definitely emotional. And then she starts to sing, and she's crying before she starts to sing. And then the GIs, that's not what they're called, the soldiers in the room start to hum along with her. It becomes very moving and very sweeping. And so I agree with, it wasn't my favorite scene, but it's definitely a great scene. So the two things I'll piggyback or tack on to the end of this. Number one, the German singer, Christiane Kubrick.
Oh, really?
They met on set, and she became his third wife 2 years later. And by the way, third wife and last wife.
Yeah.
And then
at 3, Jason, hold on. At 3 in 1959, you're not marriage material.
Yes, I think this is right.
He wasn't an old man. It's not
exactly
like he's not Johnny Carson, some lech who's, grabbing on to some young wife. I mean, he was a young man at that point, and if he's already on his third marriage, he's an artist. He needs to go in the direction of the art.
Well, I don't remember which scene it was, but at some point he made somebody do 68 takes in this movie. And this is way before The Shining. So he already had that in him, that kind of lunacy about getting so much stuff on tape. Not tape, on film.
Right.
The other weird thing, and this is kind of like my thing about Vinny Serrato on one of our pods a couple years ago. The guy who played Major St. Alban, who is General Miro's, I guess, underling, his name is Richard Anderson. We would know the actor Richard Anderson as a character called Oscar Goldman.
What? Oscar Goldman?
Who is Oscar Goldman? He's the boss of the $6 Million Man.
Oh, my God. I was just placing that name because I was like, why is that giving me a 40-year-old virgin vibe to hear that name? And that's the part where he walks in. He's like, is this the $6 Million Man's boss? Is this Oscar Goldman? He had the doll in his coterie, in his collection of action figures. Okay, that's brilliant. That's why we have you on the podcast there, Jason, to bring us these types of kernels, of nuggets of gold out of these films. Well, I for the sake of time, I do want to get to it, All Quiet on the Western Front, because, as you know, I am a huge military war movie buff. I like the genre. I'm also a military history fan. I also am that kind of critical douchebag that if I feel like things are inauthentic or outside of the scope of the, I would say the historical lexicon, I get all bent out of shape about it, and I'm one of those types of people. I know they're obnoxious. This movie so impressed me, I tried to get as many people as I could to go and see it. I would like, before I get into it, your impressions about the movie, having seen it. I believe you said you watched it on Netflix and that was at home?
That's correct. So let me ask you, did you see this in the theater?
Oh, I did. It was appointment viewing for me.
So I'm jealous, and we'll certainly talk about that, I guess, after I give you my initial impressions. So with All Quiet, I'll just say some things, and I'll let you give you something to react to. It moved way faster than the 2.5-hour runtime would lead you to believe, which means to me that it was engaging. I thought it was kind of a spectacle movie. It was, even though there are quieter moments, there are wow shots that are widescreen. There's a lot of scope and perspective. And I want to bring up two names that maybe are not directly informative of this, but I think I can bring one of them in for sure. And those are Denis Villeneuve and Terrence Malick, who are artists, directors that have done very long form movies, 2.5, almost 3 hours, that have tremendous cinematography, and also kind of place you into uncomfortable spaces. And I feel like that's what this movie did.
I thought it did that as well as a war movie can do it. That's part of the objective in my mind, and I don't know the name of the director. I am kicking myself that I didn't do the research, but it's a German film, and so it's told from a German perspective, and I believe...
Pat, real quick, he's called Edward Berger. I don't know his work other than he did this TV show where he directed, I think, 6 of 8 episodes. It was called Deutschland 83, and it was kind of a spy show. It's German. It's in German language. And so I was aware of the name from that, and I can kind of see some of the beginnings. This is probably 5 or 6 years old. Sorry to interrupt you, but that's the guy's name.
Oh, great. No, I was going to ask whether or not you had that at the tip of your tongue, and you certainly did. So as bad as it must have been to be on the Allied side, we rarely ever take the perspective of, okay, you were a German soldier in World War I, and you didn't pick the fight, yet years in, you didn't have any allies left. I mean, it was Germany practically propping up Austria. Italy then falls to the extent that they were part of the Axis at all, and Turkey falls, and now it's Germany fighting everybody. And the degradation that the soldiers on the German side experienced, yet they were part of a, I don't want to call it unholy machine, but maybe that's what it was, an unholy machine. And I think the director did an excellent job at giving you both sides of that. What it was to be a soldier in that army, and yet this is what it was about. And this is what was going on. And this is what not only the experience was of the soldier, but this is what the experience of the victims of the soldier were. I thought that the scope of it was appropriate. that when you saw these charges coming out of the trenches, and we can contrast that with what Kubrick did. What Kubrick did was clever and smart with what he had to work with. What this director did, Berger, he used the money and the technology and the opportunity that he had to show what it was to have these swaths of human beings come out of these trenches and charge into, like 19th century soldiers, 20th century technology, and what that did to them, how brutal it was, how foolhardy it was, how efficient it was to kill them. And that was a necessary part for me to appreciate the movie, knowing the history of it as I do. That's one of the reasons why I said I'm going to go and see this movie in the theater, even though it's 2 hours and 35 minutes or whatever it was, 2 hours and 40 minutes. And my final point, before I let you take the stage, I walked out of that movie, I was like, it's over? I didn't think that we had experienced close to 3 hours of a movie, which is a testament to the fact that its pacing was great. You didn't feel like things could have been cut out and the story would have been the same. You never felt bored with the way the film was progressing. Yes?
Yes, agreed. I think there's two things that work there for me. And one of them's maybe a hair controversial, not my opinion, but something I've read on the internet, is that Berger and the people that helped him adapt the screenplay, they added a thing, which is the intercutting with the Daniel Bruhl character and kind of the negotiations about the armistice, which are not in the book, the 1930 movie, or the 1979 made-for-TV movie with John Boy from the Waltons. This is a new thing. And it doesn't take up a lot of space, but it probably takes up 20 minutes. So in terms of holding our gaze, holding our attention, I think having that cross-cut to that particular story helps us stay engaged when we step away from, I guess, the 4 or 5 main guys that are German soldiers. And so I think that works for sure, right?
I think that works, and I think it was appropriate because one of the things that I did walking out of that movie, and as someone who, again, very immersed in World War I, in history, I did not realize the extent to which all of the armies, all of these different divisions that were aware of this armistice also engaged in this nonsensical attack leading up to what you'd call the 0 hour of the armistice for what can only be best categorized as hubris, but the reality of it is just sheer stupidity. So I thought that having those scenes where you're seeing the delegations hammer out the details of how they got, but we as a people got to an armistice that could seem so foolhardy and arbitrary, right? Because it's not just, hey, we came to an agreement. It's a complete and total cessation of the violence, of the fighting. It's this almost 17th or 18th century styled armistice agreement that allowed for all this liberty within the space of the execution of the agreement and the 0 hour. And without that, I don't know that you can have the final scene, right?
No, dude, it's heartbreaking because they fight right up till 10:59 on November 11th. And that's when Paul gets killed. And I was like, what the fuck, man? And the guy, they don't call him the drill sergeant. They call him whatever. One of the guys in the first 20 minutes of the movie says to Paul, you'll probably be dead by tomorrow. And here he is 24 months later, and he gets killed at the 11th hour. Oh, my God.
And as heartbreaking as that is, I was just, the pure scope of it, not just Paul, which as soon as it started happening and the extent to which it was happening, I had no expectation that he was going to survive. But then all the other soldiers around him on both sides, the fact that he kills several French soldiers, right? So in the leading up to the armistice being, I would say, I don't even know what the right word is, but being recognized, being the war being over, here he is 6 minutes, 5 minutes, 4 minutes before he's killing somebody and he's seeing his comrades being killed. The whole thing to me was so absurd, and I didn't realize the scope of which that happened all over the front in Europe. One of the most infamous situations with the Marines was them attacking into what was probably, even in the sense that, let's say it was 2 weeks, 2 months, 2 years before the day of the armistice, they attacked into a fortified position and took heavy casualties, all because of that hubris that this German general displayed at I believe he was a general. He's either a colonel or a general, displays at the end of the movie, like, if the war is over, we're not going out having quote unquote lost. We're going to spill
he says something like, these democratic socialists are going to be the death of us.
Yes.
And I think he wants to have one last charge at it.
Yep. The movie looked good, did it not?
It looks great. And for one reason, that's why it won Best Cinematography. It looks great. And there are certain scenes, and they're not just the battle scenes. I want to, first of all, cite the scene where Paul and T, what's T's name? I can't remember T's name. He ends up being his best friend, I think, throughout the movie, where it's probably late in the first act, early in the second act, where they go to a French farm and steal a goose. Do you remember this?
Steal the eggs.
Steal the eggs, okay. And where it starts from is at the edge of the forest as they're coming out, and you see this farm, and it's really pretty, and there's a little bit of haze. Maybe it's fog. Maybe it's something that Netflix pumps through their their system. But it looked really great. And I thought that was really good. The other thing that I have, and actually I'm going to do something we probably ought not do, but I'm going to read a quote. I'm going to pull it up here if you give me 30 seconds, Pat, because I think this is brilliant film criticism and writing. All right, so I mentioned Terrence Malick earlier. This is from, what's this guy's name? Ben Konigsberg with the New York Times. And what he's talking about is the spectacle of the movie and how great it looks. And what he says is it opens with a landscape, a quiet wood and mountains, seemingly at sunrise. A fox sucks from its mother's teat. A Terrence Malick-like shot looks upward at impossibly high and peaceful treetops. Berger then cuts an aerial view of drifting smokes, which clears to reveal an array of corpses. A barrage of bullets suddenly pierces the near still composition, and the camera turns to show the full extent of the carnage and the muck. This is a war as a violation of nature.
Oh, that's brilliant. That's brilliant.
It's a pretty good review. Pretty good review.
Oh, yeah. One of the things that it's hard to put into words is what those trenches and then what the no man's land looked like. And I don't know that I've seen anything that puts that into perspective as well as this movie does, because it is a true abomination, right? It's a violation of nature, the way not only foliage, trees, any kind of shrubbery, it's the ground itself. The ground itself is this pockmarked, this disgusting, muddy, trench-filled, barbed wire laden I don't even know the hellscape is probably the best, summation of that. It's just this hellscape. And one of the scenes where Paul and the French soldier find themselves locked in arms inside of the crater of either a bombshell or a mortar shell, cannon shell that has just torn the ground up to the extent that two human beings can be inside it and navigate it and then fight in it. It really illustrated that sentiment that this is violence against nature. It's a crime against nature.
This is I'm sorry to interrupt you. This is one of my favorite scenes. For one reason, because it was in the 1930 version, it was in the 1979 version, which was a TV movie, and it's in this. And I mean, I'm speaking on memory of the 1930 version because I've only seen it once. I've seen the 79 TV movie a couple times, but it's the same thing where the German character, whether they're called Paul in each one, I don't know, kills the French character, and then moves away, and then has regrets about it, and then they're alone in that crater for what, 8 hours, 10 hours?
Yes.
And it's a very moving circumstance. And I think all three movies capture it, but it was really good in this one.
Yes, the emotion that Paul goes through, speaking of course, the most recent version, the emotion that he goes through of both fear and then that kind of bloodlust and then regret in the moment where he starts trying to dress the wounds because he doesn't want to see the guy die, that was heart-wrenching. The last thing that I want to mention about the movie, the cinematography, of course I have to do this. How did you feel when they depicted the tanks approaching the trench that they had just taken, the Germans had just taken, and then the scene involving the tanks? I mean, how did you feel about that?
What I remember is the tanks going over the trenches. Is that what we're talking about?
Yes.
I feel like tanks are strong, and maybe they were new, and they were bigger than the trenches. I mean, that felt like a new thing, right? It's like, oh, hey, here's this big metal beast, and we're going to beat you down with it. I was surprised.
Yes. So it was. I didn't know if the movie was going to try it because it's. For the scope of what it is, it would have to be horrifying. And I thought the movie did that. It turned those, because that's what soldiers at that time must have felt when they saw those machines, just horrified, like this can't be real. And not only is it real, but it's all metal. And not only is it real and it's all metal, it contains some of the most lethal killing devices that man had yet come up with to that point in human history. And now you're being asked to contend with that after you have ejected your enemy out of that trench. And I thought it just perfectly illustrated the futility of such a war when the technology so far exceeded the capacity of human beings to outsmart or outwit the technology. I mean, you had tactics that were just too primitive given the technology, and to see how quickly these attacks could be successful and then could be repelled, and you just go back and forth and do that day in and day out, that you get this sense of this is all a waste of human life and time. No one's going to win this. It's simply an exercise in attrition that, but for the armistice, could have gone on for another year, right?
I think you're right about that. And what I would also say is that at one point, Daniel Brühl, when he's in one of those crosscuts about the potential armistice, is talking about the Germans losing 40,000 soldiers a month. And there's another thing. Maybe it's in Paths of Glory, or maybe it's in All Quiet. I can't remember which, but it was a narrator. I think it was in Paths. I think it was the narrator beginning of Paths where essentially they talked about from 1914 to 1918, the main years of the Western Front, that once the fronts were dug in, it was two armies fighting over what was essentially 300 yards, and they didn't go much or plus or minus. Like if there was an over or under, it would have been right in the middle, 150 yards. Nobody won.
Exactly. And I think that All Quiet did a great job of illustrating that futility in a way that, of course, Paths of Glory just didn't have the capacity to do. And that it leads me to, it's hard to compare these two movies as far as the cinematography goes, because one of them, there's just so much more. There's so much, there's bigger opportunities, there's better technology. I thought both of them did a great job at depicting trench warfare in the First World War. I thought both of them did a great job. And again, this is giving credit to Kubrick about what he did with it's working more with less. The trenches, you could tell in All Quiet that, alluded to this point several times, these guys clearly went through some sort of training together as soldiers, even though they're actors, in anticipation of shooting some of these scenes. And I'm not sure that, Kubrick really went through that and did that with them. You could tell at the end that the soldiers were actors and had just gone through wardrobe, like you said. The trench.
If I may, so with the big battle scene, and this is also just internet research, so sure it could be bullshit, but in terms of the extras for the battle scene and paths, they hired 600 German police officers who had previously had military training. But that's not the main actors. That's just kind of all of the guys that are moving around Kirk Douglas when he's blowing his whistle.
Right. Well, and there's something to be said for that they understand how to move. I guess my point was more that in All Quiet, you can tell that type of coordination existed even if you were an extra, that you were still put through a certain amount of paces because the authenticity is amazing and the way everyone looks competent. And that, to me, translates in a movie, whether or not as an actor you look competently like a soldier during a battle scene. And, Black Hawk Down, Saving Private Ryan, you can tell that these directors went through and said, it's not just the extras or it's not just the main characters. Everybody's got to have that because it won't translate properly, particularly if we do scenes of scope where you see everybody interacting and engaging in the same landscape, the same battlefield. It won't look right if you've got people who just putting on a uniform and some makeup and don't have the mindset, the mentality, the movements of a soldier. That's one of the things I wanted to point out about the contrast of the two movies. And maybe that is partly because of the cinematography and the advances in technology, that you could make some edits in 2022 and 2023 that you can't make in 1957. How did you feel about that?
Well, I mean, there's also budget, and I'm not going to try to do math at this hour, but the budget for Paths was $1 million, and apparently Kirk Douglas got $350,000 of that. So their budget was $650,000, and they did really good. But I actually believe that All Quiet is a super efficient movie. They did this for $20 million on 55 shooting days.
Oh my God.
That's really tight, right? For the scope of what this is, I think they did a really great job. I don't think I answered your question, but there you go.
Well, and I don't know that it was really a question. It was just more your impressions of, you can't really take, though, a movie from 1957 and a movie from 2023 and say, Does one look better than the other? Because I guess that's an obvious question. The 1957 movie, I think you and I were both so impressed with it. In contrast, and I am using that intentionally, in contrast to the 2023 movie, All Quiet, because Kubrick did something in that space that was probably at the time revolutionary, even though the movie didn't get the box office acclaim or the critical acclaim. What he did, again, working with so little to turn it into what he did, that's just a sign of his genius. And I don't know that you get a lot of directors these days. You mentioned two of them, Malick and Villeneuve. Am I saying his name correctly?
Yeah. Well, I mean, as far as I'm concerned.
But the atmosphere they create in their movies, that is an artist's eye. It's not relying on CGI. It's not relying on special effects. It's an artist having an idea and then being able to put that idea into place using a camera, not necessarily just manipulating film with a computer. Do you have any final thoughts about either one of these movies or both of them?
I have one thing. Maybe it'll take 3 minutes, so you cut me off. But one of your original premise, modern versus classic, a comparison of these two movies, is the landscape of movies now, and specifically that this is a Netflix property that had, as in terms of a major theater run, 2 weeks before it went out on its platform. And how we think about that, not necessarily in a didactic way, in comparison to what movies were prior to streaming, where theaters were the prospect of art, if you will.
Or the forum. That's a great point. When I heard about this movie, I made a point. I don't care where it is in the Phoenix metro area. I'm willing to drive 30, even 45 minutes to go and see it. It turns out it was playing at a small indie movie theater in downtown Phoenix. So I did end up having to drive quite a ways to go and see it. Well worth it. I mean, if anybody's seen the movie, you know how dynamic it is. And if that's on your TV, imagine it being on a bigger screen with surround sound. It was amazing. But yeah, it is a sign of the times that a movie that you and I both look at, hard to believe that it was only a $20 million production, and to get to where it got, and then for it to be owned by one of these streaming services, it does show you that movies and Hollywood, the direction of film is changing, and so quickly, I'm not sure we're really processing it. And maybe what we can do is, and I'm thinking of this on the fly, this is not something that we talked about, Jason and I talked about prior to this podcast, but we talk about maybe in the next month or so the direction of film in light of both the writer's strike, the actor's strike, these streaming services, and the fact that Hollywood hasn't really had a creative spark in the last 5 years. Film is changing and rapidly, and I don't think that not only are we processing it, but fewer and fewer people really care.
Please respect Once Upon a Time in Hollywood.
Okay, fair. Yeah, I'm not. You can't really put Tarantino's vision into what I just said, because Tarantino's got a film left, and he's not going to be able to carry. I mean, he's like a great player on a football team. You put a great player on a basketball team, you can change the entire team. You put a great player on a football team, there's still 21 other guys who get to take the field at any given point, and it's just much harder to pull that carriage. But yeah, I'd love to have that conversation with you. Any final thoughts?
No, that sounds fun. My final thoughts are, I am happy with the proposition that you brought, because these are movies I had not seen, and I am happy to have seen them. I will rewatch both, and Kirk Douglas is a fucking badass.
Kirk Douglas does really carry the movie. He has I think you said it, whether it was you used the word star power or the magnetism. It really reinforced in me because, I can remember Kirk Douglas in many of his later films when he was an older man, right? It's like looking at Clint Eastwood in the spaghetti westerns versus Clint Eastwood in movies that he's done in the last 10 years.
Right.
You don't recognize them as that young, dynamic stud of an actor with that star power in Hollywood, but that's exactly what he was.
And by the way, talent scout, he hired Kubrick for this, and then on Spartacus, fired the original guy and brought Stanley in.
Oh, really?
Yes.
So
Kubrick was not originally on Spartacus. KD, the old KD, fired the guy and brought in Kubrick to finish the movie.
Oh, I love it. I'm gonna have to go rewatch Spartacus now, because I'm sure Kubrick has his fingers all. Even though a lot of that was already shot, he has his fingers all over the editing of the film as well. So that will be an interesting rewatch. Well, Jason, look, I really appreciate it. We will, within the next 4 to 6 weeks, come up with a game plan for a conversation about the future of Hollywood in light of the strike and streaming services. And I appreciate your time, man.
Hey, I really like these. Thank you.
Act 2 Epilogue.
I like sitting in front of this microphone running my mouth. It's how this whole thing got started. It's allowed me the opportunity to figure out how podcasting works. I haven't figured out necessarily how the marketing part of it works, but the podcasting part, I believe I've got down pretty well. What I have come to realize, I do enjoy the interview process, having people on the podcast, as well as the collaboration, just having someone on the podcast to bounce ideas off of. So I'm going to try to have more guests on the podcast. Yes, that'll put pressure on all of you. I know all of you that are listening, and you're probably going to have to come on this show eventually. Prepare yourselves accordingly. This is Why Don't Vote, a podcast.